Now, amid the strained ties between the two nations, U.S. Treasury Secretary Ms. Janet Yellen has ended a 4-day Beijing trip this Sunday. Yellen said that 10 hours of bilateral meetings with senior Chinese officials during her trip were quote-unquote direct and productive, and it also will be helping stabilize the oft-rocked and reported rocky relationship between U.S. and China. Now, addressing the media, Yellen further went on to say that the United States of America and China have significant disagreements and they must be communicated clearly and directly. Yellen's visit also included talks with climate and finance experts, also women economists and several senior officials that included Premier Li Gang.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's 4-day Beijing trip ended on Sunday. Before departing China, Yellen said 10 hours of meetings with senior Chinese officials in recent days were direct and productive. She added the United States and China remained at odds on a number of issues, but expressed confidence that her visit had advanced efforts to put the relationship on, quote, surer footing.
The U.S. and China have significant disagreements. Those disagreements need to be communicated clearly and directly. But President Biden and I do not see the relationship between the U.S. and China through the frame of great power conflict. We believe that the world is big enough for both of our countries to thrive.
U.S.-China relations are at a low over national security issues, including Taiwan, U.S. export bans on advanced technologies, and China's state-led industrial policies. Washington has been trying to repair ties between the world's two biggest economies. A senior Treasury official said the trip, as expected, did not result in specific policy breakthroughs, but was very successful in terms of re-establishing contact and building relationships. Yellen met with Premier Li Qiang and People's Bank of China Deputy Governor Pan Gongsheng. She urged more cooperation between the sides on economic and climate issues, while criticizing what she called punitive actions against U.S. companies in China. She reiterated that Washington was not seeking to decouple from China's economy. The U.S. has implemented export controls designed to restrict China's ability to acquire high-tech microchips that Washington fears could have military applications. The U.S. government is also considering an executive order to curb U.S. investment in sensitive areas.
And I emphasize that it would be highly targeted and clearly directed narrowly at a few sectors where we have specific national security concerns.
Yellen stressed that any executive order would not be for economic gain and talked through what such an order might look like with her Chinese counterparts, according to the senior Treasury official.
Joining me on the broadcast now is Mr. Andrew K.P. Leong, who's an international and independent China strategist. Mr. Leong, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'd first want to understand, how does one read this visit by Ms. Yellen, considering this comes close on the heels of Antony Blinken also going to Beijing? He's held his own set of bilaterals, but just on the heels of that, there was a very strong statement that had come by U.S. President Joe Biden, where he ended up calling Xi Jinping a traitor. How does one see the U.S.-Chinese the ties that one is talking about at the moment?
Well, there is no doubt that there is a 360 degrees all society, all government, bipartisan consensus on viewing China as an existential threat to the so-called American-led global order and to American hegemony and American national interests. This is a fundamental difference between the two countries in terms of their trade practices, in terms of their ideology, in terms of their politics, and above all, the rise of China has been seen to be eating Americans' lunch and compromising Americans' dominance or leadership in the Asia Pacific and beyond. So these kind of fundamental differences are not likely to be settled just by Blinken's visit or Yellen's visit, and what are likely to follow by the visit of the U.S. Commercial Secretary and the climate envoy, John Kerry. What the United States seems to want is, on the one hand, continuing to push back against China, because this is a bipartisan consensus. Most American people view China as negatively, particularly in view of the coming U.S. presidential election. So there's not going to be any let up on that. But in spite of that, the United States wants to prevent this kind of confrontation leading into war, which neither country wants, nor is it good for the entire world. And on that, of course, China agrees. But as far as Beijing is concerned, this idea of not decoupling or de-risking is only rhetoric. But at the end of it all, the United States is going to double down on containing China's rise and putting roadblocks to China's trajectory and threatening China's own national interests, for example, Taiwan, and its development of its semiconductor industry because of the restrictions on access to the chips product, the high-end chips production, and so on. So it just reminds me of the Godfather's Corleone's favorite line. It's not personal, it's just business. But I think the Chinese culture doesn't buy that. So, but on the other hand, both China and the United States agree that the relationships need to put on a proper footing to prevent things getting out of hand.
But Mr. Long, let's actually discuss on what exactly did this trip result in, because any major agreement on breakthrough has not really been reported about as far as the many issues that plague the US and China ties, from raids on American businesses in China in recent months to US leading the call to de-risk from Chinese economy, which China had taken objection to. What about that?
Yes, as I said, I mean, the United States, on the one hand, is trying to put a floor on the relationship between the United States and China, and trying to stabilize the relationships and trying to build dialogue. But there is a gaping hole in this floor, in the sense that China so far has refused to establish direct hotline, as it were, between the two sides of the military. Because China perceives that the United States military is diametrically opposed to China's national interests. So far, we're not seeing any signals from Beijing that it wants to open up a direct dialogue with the U.S. military. So there is a kind of strategic ambiguity on the side of China to preserve its own national interests. But even on other sectors like the economy, technology, there are so much differences between the two sides that the situation is unlikely to improve. But what it has achieved is, of course, is opening up dialogue. And then we are likely to see more openings or dialogue. As I said, later on, we should be expecting a visit by the U.S. Treasury Commercial Secretary and also the climate and change envoy, John Kerry. So I think that it's good for both sides to maintain dialogue, but I think that both sides are under no illusions that it's going to be a game change in the kind of confrontational relationship between China and the United States.